Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn man to destruction and say, return, ye children of men. This is about to treat as well of the brevity and miseries of human life, as of the punishments inflicted upon the people of Israel, in order to minister some consolation for assuaging the grief and fear which the faithful might have entertained upon observing the operation of the common law, to which all mankind are subject. And especially upon considering their own afflictions, he opens the psalm by speaking of the peculiar grace which God had vouchsafed to his chosen tribes. He next briefly recites how wretched the condition of men is, if they allow their hearts to rest in this world, especially when God summons them as guilty sinners to his judgment seat. And after he has bewailed that even the children of Abraham had experienced for a time such severity that they were almost consumed with sorrow, confiding in God's free favor by which he had adopted them to himself, he prays that he would deal towards them in a merciful and a gracious manner, as he had done in times past, continue even to the end the ordinary course of his grace. A prayer of Moses, a man of God. It is uncertain whether this psalm was composed by Moses, or whether some one of the prophets framed it into a song for the use of the people from a formula of prayer written by Moses, and handed down from age to age. It is, however, highly probable that it is not without some ground ascribed to Moses in the title, and since psalms were in use even in his time, I have no doubt that he was its author. Some maintain that the reason why his name appears in the inscription is that it was sung by his posterity, but I cannot see why they should have recourse to such a groundless conceit. The epithet, the man of God, given to Moses, which is immediately added, clearly confused them. This honorable designation is expressly applied to him, that his doctrine may have the greater authority. If conjectures are to be admitted, it is probable that when the time of his death drew near, he indited this prayer to assuage the prolonged sorrow under which the people had almost pined away, and to comfort their hearts under the accumulation of adversities with which they were oppressed. Although the wonderful goodness of God shone brightly in their deliverance from Egypt, which burying their miseries formerly endured by them might have filled them with joy, yet we know that, soon after, it was extinguished by their ingratitude, so that for the space of not less than 40 years they were consumed with continual languor in the wilderness. It was therefore very seasonable for Moses at that time to beseech God that he would deal mercifully and gently with his people according to the number of the years in which he had afflicted them. Verses 1 and 2. O Lord, thou hast been our dwelling place from generation to generation. Before the mountains were brought forth, and before thou hadst formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, thou art God. O Lord, you have been our dwelling place, in separating the seed of Abraham by special privilege from the rest of the human family. The psalmist magnifies the grace of adoption by which God had embraced them as his children. The object which he has in view in this exordium is that God would now renew the grace which he had displayed in old times towards the holy patriarchs, and continue it towards their offspring. Some commentators think that he alludes to the tabernacle, because in it the majesty of God was not less conspicuous than if he had dwelt in the midst of the people. But this seems to me to be altogether out of place. He rather comprehends the whole time in which the father sojourned in the land of Canaan. The long duration here mentioned, our dwelling place from generation to generation, would not be at all applicable to it. It is not then intended to recount what God showed himself to be towards the Israelites from the time that he delivered them from Egypt, but what their fathers had experienced him to be in all ages, even from the beginning. Declared that as they had always been pilgrims and wanderers, so God was to them instead of a dwelling place, No doubt the condition of all men is unstable upon earth, but we know that Abraham and his posterity were, above all others, sojourners, and, as it were, exiles. Since then they wandered in the land of Canaan out into Egypt, where they lived only by sufferance from day to day. It was necessary for them to seek for themselves a dwelling place under the shadow of God, without which they could hardly be accounted inhabitants of the world, since they continued everywhere strangers, and were afterwards led about through many windings and turnings. The grace which the Lord displayed in sustaining them in their wanderings, and shielded them with his hand when they sojourned among savage and cruel nations, and were exposed to injurious treatment at their hands. This grace is extolled by Moses in a very striking manner, when he represents God as an abode or dwelling place to these poor fugitives who were continually wandering from one place to another in quest of lodgings. This grace he magnifies from the length of time during which it had been exercised. For God ceased not to preserve and defend them for the space of more than 400 years, during which time they dwelt under the wings of its protection. Before the mountains were brought forth, Moses designs to set forth some high and hidden mystery, and yet he seems to speak feebly, and as it were in a puerile manner. For who does not know that God existed before the world? This we grant is a truth which all men admit. But we will scarcely find 1 in 100 who is thoroughly persuaded that God remains unchangeably the same. God is here contrasted with created beings, who, as all know, are subject to continual changes, so that there is nothing stable under heaven. As in a particular manner, nothing is fuller of the vicissitude than human life, that men may not judge of the nature of God by their own fluctuating condition. He is here placed in a state of settled and undisturbed tranquility. Thus the everlastingness of which Moses speaks is to be referred not only to the essence of God, but also to his providence, by which he governs the world. Although he subjects the world to many alterations, he remains unmoved, and that not only in regard to himself, but also in regard to the faithful, who find from experience that instead of being wavering, he is steadfast in his power, truth, righteousness, and goodness, even as he has been from the beginning. This eternal and unchangeable steadfastness of God could not be perceived prior to the creation of the world, since there were as yet no eyes to be witnesses of it. But it may be gathered a posteriori, for while all things are subject to revolution and incessant changes, his nature continues always the same. There may be also here a contrast between him and all the false gods of the heathen, who have by little and little crept into the world in such vast numbers through the error and folly of men. But I have already shown the object which Moses has in view, which is that we mistake if we measure God by our own understanding, and that we must mount above the earth, yea, even above heaven itself, whenever we think upon him. Man of God was the common designation of the Jewish prophets, Judges 13:6, 1 Samuel 2:27, Psalm 90, verses 3-8. Thou shalt turn man to destruction, and shall say, Return, ye sons of Adam. For 1,000 years in thy sight are as yesterday when it is gone, and as a watch in the night. Thou carriest them away as with a flood. They will be asleep. In the morning he shall grow as grass. In the morning it shall flourish and grow. At the evening it shall be cut down and shall wither. Verse 3, You shall turn man to destruction. Moses in the first place mentions how frail and transitory is the life of man and bewails its miseries. This he does not for the purpose of quarreling with God, but as an argument to induce him the more readily to exercise his mercy, even as he is elsewhere said to pardon mortal men, when he considers of what they are made and remembers that they are but dust and grass, Psalm 103, verse 14. He compares the course of our life to a ring or circle, because God, placing us upon the earth, turns us about within a narrow circuit, and when we have reached the last point, draws us back to himself in a moment. Others give a different interpretation. Namely, that God leads man forth to death, and afterwards restores him at the resurrection. But this subtlety is far-fetched and does not harmonize with the context. We have here laid down a simple definition of our life, that it is, as it were, a short revolution in which we quickly complete our circle, the last point of which is the termination of our earthly course. This account of human life sets in a clear light the gracious manner in which God deals with his servants in adopting them to be his peculiar people, that he may at length gather them together into his everlasting inheritance. Nor is it in vain that it is added by way of contrast, verse 4, that 1,000 years in God's sight are as yesterday. Although we are convinced from experience that men, when they have completed their circle, are forthwith taken out of the world, yet the knowledge of this frailty fails in making a deep impression upon our hearts, because we do not lift our eyes above the world, whence proceeds the great stupidity of men who, bound fast to the present state of existence, proceed in the affairs of life as if they were to live 2,000 years, but because they do not elevate their conceptions above visible objects. Each man, when he compares himself with others, flatters himself that he will live to a great age. In short, men are so dull as to think that 30 years or even a smaller number are, as it were, an eternity, nor are they impressed with the brevity of their life so long as this world keeps possession of their thoughts. This is a reason why Moses awakens us by elevating our minds to the eternity of God, without the consideration of which we perceive not how speedily our life vanishes away. The imagination that we shall have a long life resembles a profound sleep in which we are all benumbed, until meditation upon the heavenly life swallow up this foolish fancy respecting the length of our continuance upon earth. As men are thus blinded, Moses sets before their view God as their judge. O Lord, as if he had said, if men would duly reflect upon that eternity from which you behold these inconstant circlings of the world, they would not make so great account of the present life. Instead of seriously considering what is true duration, they rather willfully turn away their eyes from heaven. This explains why they are so stupid and look upon one day as if it were 100 years. Moses' apostrophe to God is emphatic, implying that his patience being exhausted at seeing us so thoughtless, he addresses himself to God, and that it was labor to no purpose for him to speak to the deaf, who would not be taught that they were mortal, no, not even by the proofs of this, which experience was constantly presenting before them, quoted by the Apostle Peter in a sense somewhat different, 2 Peter 3, verse 8, while at the same time he does not pervert it, for he aptly and judiciously applies the testimony of Moses in illustration of the subject of which he is there treating. The design of Moses is to elevate the minds of men to heaven by withdrawing them from their own gross conceptions. And what is the object of Peter? As many, because Christ does not hasten his coming according to their desire, cast off the hope of the resurrection through the weariness of long delay, he corrects this preposterous impatience by a very suitable remedy. He perceives men's faith and the divine promises fainting and failing, from their thinking that Christ delays his coming too long. Whence does this proceed but because they grovel upon the earth? Peter therefore appropriately applies these words of Moses to cure this vice, as the indulgence and pleasures to which unbelievers yield themselves is to be traced to this, that having their hearts too much set upon the world, they do not taste the pleasures of a celestial eternity, so impatience proceeds from the same source. Hence we learn the true use of this doctrine. To what is it owing that we have so great anxiety about our life that nothing suffices us, and that we are continually molesting ourselves, but because we foolishly imagine that we shall nestle in this world forever? Again, to what are we to ascribe that extreme fretfulness and impatience, which makes our hearts fail in waiting for the coming of Christ, but to their groveling upon the earth? Let us learn, then, not to judge according to the understanding of the flesh, but to depend upon the judgment of God, And let us elevate our minds by faith, even to this heavenly throne, from which he declares that this earthly life is nothing. Nor does Moses simply contrast 1,000 years with one day, but he contrasts them with yesterday, which is already gone. For whatever is still before our eyes has a hold upon our minds, but we are less affected with the recollection of what is past. In regard to the word watch, the ancients, as is well known, were accustomed to divide the night into 4 watches, consisting of 3 hours each. To express still more forcibly how inconsiderable that which appears to us a long period is in God's eyes, this similitude is added, that 1,000 years in his sight differ nothing from 3 hours of the night, in which men scarcely know whether they are awake or asleep. You carry them as with a flood. Moses confirms what he had previously said, that men, so long as they are sojourners in this world, perform as it were a revolution which lasts only for a moment. I do not limit the expression to carry away as with a flood to calamities of a more grievous kind, but consider that death is simply compared in general to a flood. For when we have stayed a little while in the world, we forthwith fall into the grave and are covered with earth. Thus, death, which is common to all, is with propriety called an inundation. While we are breathing the breath of life, the Lord overflows us by death, just as those who perish in a shipwreck are engulfed in the ocean, so that death may be fitly called an invisible deluge. And Moses affirms that it is then evidently seen that men who flatter themselves that they are possessed of wonderful vigor in their earthly course are only as asleep. The comparison of grass which is added amounts to this, that men come forth in the morning as grass springs up, that they become green or pass away within a short time. When being cut down, they wither and decay. The verbs in the 6th verse being in the singular number, it is better to connect them with the word grass, but they may also be appropriately referred to each man. And as it makes little difference as to the sense of the text, whether we make grass or each man the nominative to the verbs, I am not disposed to expend much labor upon the matter. This doctrine requires to be continually meditated upon, for although we all confess that nothing is more transitory than our life, yet each of us is soon carried away, as it were, by a frantic impulse to picture to his own imagination an earthly immortality. Whoever bears in mind that he is mortal restrains himself, that instead of having his attention and affections engrossed beyond measure with earthly objects, he may advance with haste to his mark. When we set no limit to our cares, we require to be urged forward by continual goadings, that we may not dream of 1,000 lives instead of one, which is but as a shadow that quickly vanishes away. Verse 7, for we fell by thy anger. Moses makes mention of the anger of God advisedly, for it is necessary that men be touched with a feeling of this, in order to their considering in good earnest what experience constrains them to acknowledge, how soon they finish their course and pass away. He had, however, still another reason for joining together the brevity of human life and the anger of God. Whilst men are by nature so transitory, and as it were shadowy, the Israelites were afflicted by the hostile hand of God, and his anger is less supportable by our frail natures, which speedily vanish away, than it would be were we furnished with some tolerable degree of strength. Verse 8, thou hast set our iniquities before thee. To show that by this complaint he is far from intending to murmur against God, he asserts that the divine anger, however terrible it had been, was just, inasmuch as the people had provoked it by their iniquities. For those who, when stricken by the divine hand, are not brought to genuine humiliation, harden themselves more and more to profit, and also to subdue our pride, is to feel that he is a righteous judge. Accordingly Moses, after having briefly taught that men by nature vanish away like smoke, this, that it is not to be wondered at, if God consumes those whom he pursues with his wrath. The manner of the expression by which God is described as showing the tokens of his anger is to be observed. He sets the iniquities of men before his eyes. Hence it follows that whatever intermission of punishment we experience ought in justice to be ascribed to the forbearance of God, who buries our sins, that he may spare us. The word which I have rendered our secret sins is translated by some, our youth, as if Moses had said that the faults committed in youth are brought to remembrance. But this is too forced and inconsistent with the scope of the passage, for it would destroy the contrast between secret sins and the light of God's countenance, by which Moses intimates that men hide themselves in darkness and wrap themselves in many deceits, so long as God does not shine upon them with the light of his judgment, whereas when he draws them back from their subterfuges, by which they endeavor to escape from him, and sets before his eyes the sins which they hide by hypocrisy, being subdued by fear and dread, they are brought sincerely to humble themselves before him. Our home or our dwelling place. This image seems to have a particular reference to the unsettled condition of the Israelites before their establishment in the land of promise. Strangers and pilgrims as we have hitherto been, in every succeeding generation from the days of Abraham, first sojourners in Canaan and bondsmen in Egypt, now wanderers in this dreary waste, we nevertheless find the comforts of a home and settlement in your miraculous protection, end quote, hoarsely. Psalm 90 verses 9 and 10. For all our days are passed away in your indignation. Years, as it were, a thought. In the days of our years there are 60 years and 10. And if through strength there are 80 years, yet is our pride but laboring grief. For it swiftly passes by, and we fly away. Verse 9, for all our days are passed away in your indignation. This might be viewed as the general confirmation of the preceding sentence, that the whole course of man's life is suddenly brought to an end as soon as God shows himself displeased. But in my opinion, Moses rather amplifies what he has said above concerning the rigor of God's wrath, and his strict examination of every case in which he punishes sin. He asserts that this terror which God brought upon his people was not only for a short time, but that it was extended without intermission even to death. He complains that the Jews had almost wasted away by continual miseries, because God neither remitted nor mitigated his anger. It is therefore not surprising to find him declaring that their years were passed away like a tale, when God's anger rested upon them so unremittingly. Verse 10, and the days of our years are 60 years and 10. He again returns to the general doctrine respecting the precariousness of the condition of men. Although God may not openly display his wrath to terrify them, what, says he, is the duration of life? Truly, if we reckon all our years, we at length come to 60. If there be some who are stronger and more vigorous, they will bring us even a 80. Moses uses the expression, the days of our years, for the sake of emphasis. For when the time is divided into small portions, the very number itself deceives us, so that we flatter ourselves that life is long. With a view of overthrowing these vain delusions, he permits men to sum up the many thousand days which are in a few years, while he at the same time affirms that this great heap is soon brought to nothing. Let men then extend the space of their life as much as they please by calculating that each year contains 365 days. Yet assuredly they will find that the term of 70 years is short. When they have made a lengthened calculation of the days, this is the sum in which the process ultimately results. He who has reached the age of 80 years hastens to the grave. Himself lived longer, Deuteronomy 34, verse 7, and so perhaps did others in his time. But he speaks here of the ordinary term, and even then those who were accounted old men, and in a manner decrepit, who attain to the age of 80 years, so that he justly declares that it is the robust only who arrive at that age. He puts pride for the strength or excellence of which men boast so highly. The sense is that before men decline and come to old age, Even in the very bloom of youth, they are involved in many troubles, and that they cannot escape from the cares, weariness, sorrows, fears, griefs, inconveniences, and anxieties to which this mortal life is subject. Moreover, this is to be referred to the whole course of our existence in the present state. And assuredly, he who considers what is the condition of our life from our infancy until we descend into the grave will find troubles and turmoil in every part of it. The reason which is added for it swiftly passes by, and we fly away, seems hardly to suit the scope of the passage, for felicity may be brief, and yet on that account it does not cease to be felicity. But Moses means that men foolishly glory in their excellence, since whether they will or not, they are constrained to look to the time to come, and as soon as they open their eyes, they see that they are dragged and carried forward to death with rapid haste, and that their excellence is every moment vanishing away. 90 verse 11 to 13, who knows the power of your anger? And according to your fear, so is your wrath. Teach us so to number our days, and we shall apply our hearts to wisdom. Return, O Jehovah. How long? Be pacified towards your servants. Verse 11, who knows the power of your anger? Moses again returns to speak of the peculiar afflictions of the Israelites, for he had also on this occasion complained before of the common frailty and miseries of mankind. He justly exclaims that the power of God's wrath is immeasurably great. So long as God withholds his hand, men wantonly leap about like runaway slaves who are no longer afraid at the sight of their master. Nor can their rebellious nature be reduced to obedience in any other way than by striking them with the fear of his judgment. The meaning then is that while God hides himself, and, so to speak, dissembles his displeasure, men are inflated with pride and rush upon sin with reckless impetuosity. But when they are compelled to feel how dreadful his wrath is, they forget their loftiness and are reduced to nothing. What follows? According to your fear, so is your wrath, is commonly explained as denoting that the more a man is inspired with reverence towards God, and sternly is he commonly dealt with. For judgment begins at the house of God, 1 Peter 4, verse 17. Whilst he pampers a reprobate with the good things of this life, he wastes his chosen ones with continual troubles, and in short, whom he loves, he chastens, Hebrews 12, verse 6. It is then a true and profitable doctrine that he deals more roughly with those who serve him than with the reprobate. But Moses, I think, has here a different meaning, which is that it is a holy awe of God, and that alone which makes us truly and deeply feel his anger. We see that the reprobate, although they are severely punished, only chafe upon the bit, or kick against God, or become exasperated, or are stupefied as if they were hardened against all calamities so far as they are from being subdued. But though they are full of trouble, and cry aloud, yet the divine anger does not so penetrate their hearts as to abate their pride and fierceness. The minds of the godly alone are wounded with the wrath of God, for the thunderbolts to which the reprobate hold out their hard and iron necks. But they tremble the very moment when God moves only his little finger. This I consider to be the true meaning of the prophet. He had said that the human mind could not sufficiently comprehend the dreadfulness of the divine wrath. And we see how, although God shakes heaven and earth, many notwithstanding, like the giants of old, treat this with derision, and are actuated by such brutish arrogance that they despise him when he brandishes his bolts. But as the psalmist is treating of a doctrine which properly belongs to true believers, he affirms that they have a strongly sensitive feeling of the wrath of God, which makes them quietly submit themselves to his authority. Although to the wicked their own conscience is a tormentor, which does not allow them to enjoy repose, yet so far is this secret dread from teaching them to humble themselves, that it excites them to clamor against God with increasing frowardness. In short, the faithful alone are sensible of God's wrath, and being subdued by it, they acknowledge that they are nothing, and with true humility devote themselves wholly to him. This is wisdom to which the reprobate cannot attain, because they cannot lay aside the pride with which they are inflated. They are not touched with the feeling of God's wrath because they do not stand in awe of him. Number 12. Teach us so to number our days. Some translate to the number of our days, which gives the same sense. As Moses perceived that what he had hitherto taught is not comprehended by the understandings of men until God shine upon them by his Spirit, he now sets himself to prayer. It indeed seems at first sight absurd to pray that we may know the number of our years. What? Since even the strongest scarcely reach the age of fourscore years. Is there any difficulty in reckoning up so small a sum? Children learn numbers as soon as they begin to prattle, and we do not need a teacher in arithmetic to enable us to count the length of 100 upon our fingers. So much the fouler and more shameful is our stupidity in never comprehending the short term of our life. Even he who is most skillful in arithmetic, and who can precisely and accurately understand and investigate millions of millions, is nevertheless unable to count fourscore years in his own life. It is surely a monstrous thing that men can measure all distances without themselves, that they know how many feet the moon is distant from the center of the earth, what space there is between the different planets, and in short that they can measure all the dimensions both of heaven and earth, while yet they cannot number 10 years in their own case. It is therefore evident that Moses had good reason to beseech God for ability to perform what requires a wisdom which is very rare among mankind. The last clause of the verse is also worthy of special notice. By it he teaches us that when we truly apply our hearts to wisdom, when we comprehend the shortness of human life, what can be a greater proof of madness than to ramble about with oneself in any end? True believers alone, who know the difference between this transitory state and a blessed eternity for which they were created, know what ought to be the aim of their life. No man then can regulate his life with a settled mind, but he who, knowing the end of it, that is to say, death itself, is led to consider the great purpose of man's existence in this world, that he may aspire after the prize of the heavenly calling. Verse 13, Return, O Jehovah, how long? After having spoken in the language of complaint, Moses adds a prayer, that God, who had not ceased for a long time severely to punish his people, would at length be inclined to deal gently with them. Although God daily gave them in many ways some taste of his love, yet their banishment from the land of promise was a very grievous affliction, for it admonished them that they were unworthy of that blessed inheritance which he had appointed for his children. They could not fail often to remember that dreadful oath which he had thundered out against them. Surely they shall not see the land which I swear to their fathers, neither shall any of them that provoke me see it. But as for you, your carcasses shall fall in this wilderness. Numbers 14, verse 23 and 32. Moses no doubt combines that sore bondage which they had suffered in Egypt with their wanderings in the wilderness, and therefore he justly bewails their protracted languishing in the words, how long? As God is said to turn his back upon us, or to depart to a distance from us, when he withdraws the tokens of his favor, so by his return we are to understand the manifestation of his grace. The word which we have translated, pacified, signifies to repent, and may therefore not improperly be explained thus. Let it repent thee concerning your servants, according to the not unfrequent and well-known phraseology of Scripture. God is said to repent when putting away men's sorrow and affording new ground of gladness. He appears as it were to be changed. Those, however, seem to come near the mind of the psalmist who translate, Comfort yourself over your servants, for God, in cherishing us, tenderly takes no less pleasure in us than does a father in his own children. Now, that is nothing else than to be pacified or propitious, as we have translated it, to make the meaning more obvious. Verses 14 to 17. Satiate us early with your goodness, and we will be glad and rejoice all our days. Make us joyful according to the days of our affliction, according to the years in which we have seen evil. Let your work appear towards your servants, and your glory upon their children. And let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us, and direct the work of our hands upon us. Yea, direct the work of our hands. Verse 16. Let your work appear towards your servants. As God, when he forsakes his church, puts on, as it were, a character different from his own, Moses, with much propriety, calls a blessing of protection which had been divinely promised to the children of Abraham God's proper work. God's work was manifest in all the instances in which he had punished the perfidiousness, ingratitude, obstinacy, unruly lusts, and unhallowed desires of his people. Yet Moses, by way of eminence, prefers before all other proofs of God's power that care which he exercised in maintaining the welfare of the people, by which it was his will that he should be principally known. This is the reason why Paul in Romans 9 verse 23 especially applies to the divine goodness the honorable title of glory. God indeed maintains his glory by judging the world, but as nothing is more natural to him than to show himself gracious, his glory on that account is said to shine forth chiefly in his benefits. With respect to the present passage, God had then only begun to deliver his people, for they had still to be put in possession of the land of Canaan. Accordingly, had they gone no further than the wilderness, the luster of their deliverance would have been obscured. Besides, Moses estimates the work of God according to the divine promise. In doing this, he affirms that it will be imperfect and incomplete unless he continue his grace even to the end. This is expressed still more plainly in the second clause of the verse, in which he prays not only for the welfare of his own age, but also for the welfare of the generation yet unborn. His exercise thus corresponds with the form of the covenant. And I will establish my covenant between me and you, and your seed after you, in their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be a God to you, and to your seed after you. Genesis 17, verse 7. By this example we are taught that in our prayers we ought to extend our care to those who are to come after us. As God has promised that the church will be perpetuated even to the end of the world, a subject which was brought under our notice in the preceding psalm, this ought in a special manner to lead us in all the prayers by which we commend the welfare of the church to him, to include at the same time our posterity who are yet unborn. Further, the words glory and beauty are to be particularly noticed, from which we learn that the love which God bears toward us is unparalleled. Although in enriching us with his gifts he gains nothing for himself, yet he would have the splendor and beauty of his character manifested in dealing bountifully with us, as if his beauty were obscured when he ceases to do us good. In the clause immediately succeeding, direct the work of our hands upon us, Moses intimates that we cannot undertake or attempt anything with the prospect of success unless God become our guide and counselor and govern us by his Spirit. Whence it follows that the reason why the enterprises and efforts of worldly men have a disastrous issue is because in not following God they pervert all order and throw everything into confusion. Nor is the word superfluous, for although God converts to good in the end whatever Satan and the reprobate plot and practice against him or his people, yet the church in which God rules with undisturbed sway has in this respect a special privilege. By his providence, which to us is incomprehensible, he directs his work in regard to the reprobate externally, but he governs his believing people internally by his Holy Spirit, and therefore he is properly said to order or direct the work of their hands. The repetition shows that a continual course of perseverance in the grace of God is required. It would not be enough for us to be brought to the midst of our journey. He must enable us to complete the whole course. Some translate confirm or establish, and this sense may be admitted. I have, however, followed that translation, which was more agreeable to the context, conceiving the prayer to be that God would direct to a prosperous issue all the actions and undertakings of his people.